I want to start by reading from an email that a friend of ours wrote, he's the deputy editor of the Washington Post editorial page, and his name is David Von Draley, and he's a wonderful writer. So he said, Evan, your book arrived, and though I'm pulled in 10 directions lately, I made the mistake of looking at the first page. Now, 30 minutes later, wow. The introduction is one of the best I've ever read, crisp, authoritative, going like a bat out of hell. And that is actually how the entire book reads, and as you will find when you buy one over there. So, Evan, let's start by asking why you wrote this book.
I grew up in the 1950s, like a few of you, and I was scared of the atom bomb. I'm still scared, actually a little more scared, given recent headlines. I also had a personal connection to the dropping of the atom bomb. My father was a junior officer on an LST, a landing ship tank, that was going from Europe, where he'd been in D-Day, among other things, to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan in the summer of 1945. And the story in my family, amongst my siblings, always was we were alive because we dropped the atom bomb on Japan and obviated that invasion. At the same time, I was always troubled by the question that did we really have to drop the bomb? Was it really necessary? And was it necessary to drop 2 of them? That was a nagging question that just bothered me, and I wanted to find out.
So you tell a sweeping story through 3 characters. 2 are American and 1 is Japanese. And how did you pick these 3 people?
Well, you have to, a lot has been written on this subject. I mean, you can fill whole libraries. But I like to write narrative, and I like to write personal narrative. And I used to work for Newsweek, and we had at Newsweek the expression, what we called the Russian novel problem. Real life is a Russian novel. Too many characters, too many plots. And you've got to figure out a way to boil it down. The obvious character is Harry Truman, the president. But Truman is a problematic figure for historians because, like some other presidents, he made up a little bit after the fact. He projects this image, and properly so, being a decisive, the buck stops here, Harry Truman. But in the summer of 1945, it's a lot less clear how decisive he really was. The guy who ran the Manhattan Project that built the bomb, the general, whose name was Groves, said that the president was actually a little boy on a toboggan, meaning hurtling down the hill, out of control, not running things. Now that is a harsh and I think unfair judgment. He was the president. He did decide, but he wasn't the central figure. And now the other central figure is Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist who in some ways built the bomb or helped create the bomb. He's been done. That book won a Pulitzer Prize. There's a movie coming out about Oppenheimer in about a month. I hope to hop on that train myself to sell some more books, but I felt he'd been done. So we needed to find other characters.
The main Central American character is Henry Stimson, Secretary of War. He is 77 years old. He's already served in 3 administrations. He has a serious heart condition. He is tired, and what I find telling about him is his favorite sport to relax is called lawn bowls.
He was a very proper, erect, WASP gentleman. He was sort of the godfather of a group known as the Wise Men. Walter Isaacson and I, 30 years ago, wrote a book called The Wise Men, and the kind of patron saint of this group, the model, was Henry Stimson, a Wall Street lawyer who served 6 presidents, Secretary of State, Secretary of War twice, very erect, was known as a New England conscience on legs, also known as the icicle because he could be pretty chilly. And he was a severe and very proper guy. His coat is always buttoned to the top button in his photographs. However, this book begins in March of 1945, he has a diary, thank God, because authors need characters with diaries. He has a diary, and in the diary he calls the atom bomb by its code name, which is S1, or the British code name, which is tube alloys, but he also calls it the terrible, the awful, the diabolical, a Frankenstein monster. He knew what they were building, and he also knew that the time was coming when we would probably have to use this thing. The bomb was getting ready to drop, and we had a target to drop them on. But he was caught in this terrible quandary. He wanted the war to end. He didn't want to drop the bomb, but he wanted the war to end. And in April, he and his wife Mabel go down to Florida for some R&R, and they go to what's called a redistribution center. And that is a place where pilots are coming from Europe to be reassigned and sent out to the Pacific. And he looks at these men, and he sees how exhausted they are, how tired they are. And he really does not want to send them out to fight another desperate and bloody war. He's aware that, this is April, the United States has just spent 5 weeks and lost 7,000 men taking Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is the size of Nantucket. You know, it's a postage stamp. They are starting the invasion of Okinawa, a bigger island, but still a fraction of the size of the islands they're going to have to conquer in Japan. So he's well aware of the terrible costs of this invasion, what it's going to cost in men. At the same time, just to show you what's on his mind, he's very troubled by the firebombing of Japan. Starting in March, the Air Force starts to drop incendiaries in Japan. In March 10th, 1945, the United States, burned 15 square miles of Tokyo, killed 100,000 people, burned 100,000 people in one night, more people than died in any 12-hour battle in the history of mankind. So there's already a big cost in Japanese lives that he has to deal with. He doesn't like the firebombing. It's a brutal thing. And he goes to President Truman in June, and he says, well, he wants to cut back on the firebombing for two reasons. One is that he doesn't want the United States to look like Germany, look like Nazi Germany, to be accused of atrocities like Hitler. This is just at the time that we're finding out about the concentration camps. And so he doesn't want to be like the Germans. But he's also worried that if we burn all the cities, there won't be a proper backdrop for this new weapon that they're building. There won't be any way to show off the atom bomb. And he writes in his diary that Truman laughs. Now, think about this. That's not a happy laugh. That's a dark laugh. That's a grim, these are two men confronted with an impossible situation who are the president's giving a small, bitter laugh because of the irony of having to preserve these cities to burn them. What else are they going to do? They're going to respond the way people always have to hard choices. They're going to try to make a dark joke. You know, wars are easy to start, but they're hard to end.
So the U.S. has, with Stimson, part of his job is to get money out of Congress. They have spent $2 billion in the effort to build the first atomic bomb. And you had said he knew what they had, but did he know the destructive power of the bomb?
Well, not really. I mean, this is a brand new thing. And when in the spring they tested it finally at Trinity, and the Trinity test down in the New Mexico desert. But it was a new thing, and so Oppenheimer was asked, how big is this going to be? The bombs were dropping on Japan, and he said, well, somewhere between 2 and 20 kilotons. Actually, the Hiroshima bomb was 12 kilotons, and the Nagasaki bomb was 20 kilotons, so at the high end. Oppenheimer was also asked, how many people will it kill? and he answered about 20,000. Actually, the bomb on Hiroshima killed 70,000 right away, and then another 70,000 more slowly by radiation poisoning. So, you know, they didn't quite realize just how deadly it was. In one of these dark ironies, one reason why he thought it would kill 20,000 and not more was they expected people to take cover because there would be air raid sirens and the people would take cover. There were air raid sirens, but people didn't take cover in Hiroshima because they hadn't been bombed. It was that rare Japanese city that had been spared, and they'd become accustomed to American planes flying overhead without dropping bombs on them. So they looked up, the sirens went off, they saw a couple of planes up there, and they were looking up when the bomb went off, and that was one reason why the death toll was higher than expected.
In that same meeting where Oppenheimer talked about the 2 to 20,000 kilotons, he also said that if you just drop a bomb as a demonstration bomb, it would be like a big firecracker, a big explosion doing little damage. And so Truman, they are talking about real city targets. And what does Truman say about that?
So on the night that Truman gives the order to drop the atom bomb, he writes in his diary, he writes that, I have instructed the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and we are in agreement that the target will be a purely military target. The targets will be soldiers and sailors, not women and children. Well, actually the target was a bridge in the middle of Hiroshima, a city that's full of wooden buildings. And yes, 10,000 soldiers were killed, but 60,000 civilians were killed, and most of them were women and children because most of the men were off at war. So what was Truman thinking? And we don't know for sure because there's no record of it, but we do know from Stimson's diary and other sources that what they talked about that afternoon was Kyoto. As it happened, the city that had been first on the target list was the city of Kyoto, which is the ancient cultural capital of Japan. If any of you have been there, it's still a very beautiful ancient city. Osi and I have been there. And Henry Stimson did not want to bomb it. Groves, I mentioned Groves earlier, the guy who snidely referred to Truman as a little boy in a toboggan. He put Kyoto at the top of the target list 3 times. Stimson took it off 3 times. Finally, the last time going to the President of the United States to get it off the target list. So it may be one of these things where they felt that they'd save this city. They, in their own mind, said, well, Hiroshima must be a military city. It was a port city. There was a headquarters unit there. So it was sort of a military target. But there's an element of denial. We all experience this in our own lives. And maybe it's even greater when you're about to kill thousands of people.
So the order goes out to drop the bomb after the Trinity test is successful. And it's July 26, 1945. I think they're in Potsdam, Truman and Stimson. And it is to bomb each of 4 cities, Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, and Niigata, as bombs are raid ready. Order goes from Stimson to General Tooey Spaatz. So who is Tooey Spaatz?
Tooey Spaatz, somebody you probably never heard of, maybe some of you have. He ran the air war in Europe, the strategic bombing in Europe, bombing Germany. He was my favorite kind of general. He was low key. I often think in World War II there's sort of 2 types of generals. There were these hard-charging, melodramatic kind of show-offs like General Patton or Admiral Halsey in the Pacific or General MacArthur. Then there were more low-key generals, Bradley, Spruance. We needed both. We needed the big hot dogs who wanted glory because you need people like that. We also needed the prudent, low-key ones to work with them and sometimes to restrain them. And it was a odd couple, as it were, but often a successful odd couple. But Spaatz was in the uncomplaining, low-key, don't show off type who did his duty. And he was an admirable man in many ways, but he was troubled by what he was doing. Because the United States in World War II wanted to do what they call precision bombing, meaning dropping bombs through a Norden bomb site on military targets that was precise. And that worked in Kansas on a sunny day with no wind. But over Germany, when it's cloudy and windy and the Luftwaffe is shooting at you and there's flak in the air, we missed. These pilots, they would drop the bombs too early, or they bombed Switzerland twice by mistake. The famous bombing of Dresden, one wing bombed Prague by mistake. I mean, it was a very imprecise thing. And of course, Spaatz knew this. And it meant that as a practical matter, we were bombing cities. The British were already doing this sort of without shame, because the Germans had bombed British cities. So there was a kind of moral equality in the British bombing German cities. And the British are a little more bloody-minded and made no bones about it. Bomber Harris, the head of their bomber command, and they would bomb cities by making a fire X in the middle and then dropping their bombs on it. But Spaatz wanted to be a precision bomber, and he, for instance, bombing French cities, he would argue that, only visual, no radar. He did things, but of course it didn't work. And so the night after, I thought this was very telling, the night after the British and the Americans bombed Dresden, you know this story. Dresden was a beautiful medieval city, untouched, full of great architecture, and British and American planes reduced it to ashes with incendiaries in a couple of nights in February 1945. And 2 nights after that, Stimson blew $1,700 on a poker game.
Spaatz.
Spaatz blew 2 months' salary, $1,700 on a poker game. And he had, I know this because his granddaughter told me about it, he got his assistant to write his wife, Mrs. Spaatz, saying, sorry, I just lost 2 months' salary. And of course she understood, because she understood that he had to relieve the tension of what he was doing. Every day he's sending out all these American men to die. More American airmen died over Germany than Marines died in the Pacific. I mean, there's a huge death toll. If you were flying in 1943, you had about a 1 in 4 chance of actually completing the 25 missions. And Spaatz had to increase the 25 missions to 35 missions. Why? Because you were more likely to drop the bombs on target in your last 5 missions than in your first 5 missions. It was just a calculus of war. But of course, the emotional and physical cost on everybody, including Tooey Spaatz, was pretty great. So he wants to be done. He wants to go home.
He hasn't seen his wife in 3 years, except for once.
So now he wants to go home. And they said, no, you're going to the Pacific to drop the atom bomb. And he says, it was a verbal order, and he says, if I'm going to kill 100,000 people, I want to see it in writing. So he demands a written order, the one that Ossie referred to, and he keeps it in his wallet in his back pocket. He lost it when he went to take a shower and his pants went to be cleaned, and the order disappeared. They found it, but,
So the Hiroshima bombing is as a mission, it's flawless. It's Paul Tibbets is the best pilot in the Army Air Force. The Enola Gay, which is on display in the Smithsonian today, is one of the silver plate B-29s that they've built specially for this mission. But 3 days later, it's the Nagasaki run. Well, actually, it's the Kokura run. So tell us why that's snake bit.
From start to end, first, they rehearsed this for months and months and months. And the first mission, as Ossie said, flawless. But the second mission, because what can go wrong will go wrong. First, the rendezvous with the photo plane is screwed up because the photo pilot is 10,000 feet too high. So they uselessly circle for 45 minutes, consuming gas. Then they get to their primary target, Kokura, which is a military city. It has a big arsenal. But it is clouded over by smoke from an earlier American fire raid on another city. So they can't bomb Kokura. So the pilot, Sweeney, has to fly to the secondary target, which is Nagasaki, but they're starting to run out of gas. And one guy writes in his little diary, wondering whether the Pacific will be cold when they ditch. So they get to Nagasaki, and that's clouded over too. And at the last second, they debate, should we drop it by radar, which they've been specifically told not to do. The last second, the clouds part, and the bombardier sees it, and they drop the bomb. It's a mile off target, and they arrive and they fly to Okinawa, which is on the way, and they land in the middle of another group. Air Wing is landing. When they land, they started out with 7,000 gallons of gas. They have 35 gallons left in the plane. And they're landing amidst all these other planes. The pilot says, fire every flare we've got. So they look like a 4th of July as they come in, all these flares flying off. They land, they almost hit another plane. And when the Sweeney goes to be debriefed by General Doolittle, who is the head of the 8th Air Force, famous World War II hero, it's really interesting. He says, Sweeney says, we were off target. We missed, we dropped it up the valley. And Doolittle is happy because he says General Spaatz will be happy because it killed fewer people. It only killed 35,000 people instead of 70,000 people because it was dropped in a valley and was less deadly. So it shows you where their heads were at.
It was dropped on a Mitsubishi plant by chance where the Pearl Harbor torpedoes had been manufactured. So there was a little ironic justice there. One of the wonderful things about the book is about a third of it is set in Japan, and the character is Shigenori Togo. Who is he?
Shigenori Togo, another name you've never heard of, is, I think, a huge hero because he's this dour figure. He's no fun. He's charmless. He's Japanese, but he's actually Korean or Korean ancestry. His family name is Park. His family buys the samurai name Togo to fit in better. But he's the one guy. He likes 19th century Germans. He reads Goethe, but he hates Nazis. He thinks they're a bunch of thugs. And very uncharacteristic for the Japanese. He's blunt. He's direct. He's blunt spoken. Japanese are, as you may have known, any of you have done business there or been there, like indirection. They don't like to offend anybody, and so they talk around. But Togo was direct. This is significant because he's in this group of 6 people who run Japan. It's called the Supreme War Council. And 5 of them are uniform figures. The war minister is an army general, navy minister, chiefs of staff in the army and navy, and the prime minister is an admiral. Togo is the only civilian, and he knows he's the only one who wants to surrender. The rest of them want to fight to the bitter, bitter end. But Togo wants to surrender because his country's going down. But he knows that in Japan, the word surrender is forbidden. You cannot use the word surrender. And so he's in this dangerous position because the young hotheads who kind of really run things, the young colonels and majors, Togo's a target for assassination. That's no joke in Japan. In the 1930s, 3 prime ministers were assassinated. And one of the victims of an attempted assassination is the current prime minister, Admiral Suzuki. He still has a bullet in him. In 1937, he was shot 4 times. He's lying there bleeding on the ground. And his wife, Suzuki's wife, has the presence to say to the assassins, she says, "Let me finish him off. Give me the sword." And they say, "Okay." And they leave, and she saves him. She had the presence to pretend to want to finish him off. Japan is a different country at all times, but certainly in the 1930s.
So Togo knows that really, in a way, the biggest threat is from these mid-level majors and colonels who are underlings to the ruling Supreme War Council. So tell us how the council works and what did Togo do about the hotheads?
He got them to meet in secret without any aides. Actually, more politicians follow this rule. They cleared the room because they knew the aides, if they didn't assassinate him, would turn him in for being cowards if they even talked about surrender. So he manages to get the room and have secret meetings, but it's still, they're still balking. They still don't want to do it. And to show just how balky they were, consider this scene. It's August 9th. Now, this is 3 days after Hiroshima, and the Supreme War Council is meeting, and they get word that a second Hiroshima-type bomb has just dropped on Nagasaki. So a second Japanese city has just been wiped out by an atom bomb. And the war minister says, General Anami says, wouldn't it be beautiful if the whole nation were to perish like a flower, like a cherry blossom? That's the way they were thinking. And he says, let them drop 100 bombs. Now, some of that is bluster so the hotheads below don't assassinate them all, but it also reflects their thinking. They just don't want to surrender.
This is a council of 5 military people in Togo who govern by consensus. So it matters if even one of them doesn't want to take an action. And talk about when they meet, how they meet with the emperor. Where is he in all of this?
So that you think the emperor in Japan is divine. He reports only to the gods. He is a deity. But in actual fact, his legitimacy is dependent on the military, and the military is dependent on the emperor. They're kind of in lockstep together. But the way it works in Japan is because they want to keep the emperor above politics, they bring him decisions, and he says nothing. Silence is assent. So he says nothing at all. But by 1945, Hirohito, he's a somewhat meek-seeming figure. He's kind of unprepossessing looking. He has a reedy voice, doesn't say much. But by 1945, he's getting tired of his own military. He's finally, because they don't always tell him the truth. In fact, they often don't tell him the truth. They exaggerate American defeats, and they minimize their own problems. And they want to move him into the mountains, into their bunker up in the mountains, and he doesn't, to essentially kidnap him. And he's resisting. At the same time, he is worried the Americans are going to kill him. They have burned his in May. Firebombs have not. They weren't targeting the palace, but the fire spreads and burns a bunch of palace buildings. So he's largely moved into a bomb shelter underneath his library. And he hears radio signals suggesting that the next atom bomb is coming for him. So he calls a meeting in his bunker beneath the library and with the generals and says, I agree with Togo. I agree with the foreign minister. We have to surrender. We have to accept the American demand that we surrender.
And it's unprecedented, first, that he call a meeting and that he issue what they called a sacred
decision. That even speak is unusual, but that he do this is unprecedented.
So, was that it? Final word?
No. Because the Japanese, when they surrendered, yes, but with a proviso, insisted by some of the hotheads, that yes, we'll surrender, but the emperor must remain sovereign. Well, this was unacceptable to the Americans because they wanted the emperor not to report to God, but to Douglas MacArthur. They wanted him to report to the Supreme Allied Commander. And so the United States sent back saying, no, you have to agree that the emperor will be subject to the rule of the Supreme Allied Commander. So they were back at square one because the Japanese generals wanted to keep on fighting. They thought that was an unacceptable demand. So, on it went. But the emperor actually stands up to him. It takes a few days, but he does stand up to him.
And he had. This was interesting to me. Hirohito, who is divine, who is sun god, says one of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, which was the demand for unconditional surrender, was that the ultimate form of government of the country, Japan, would be determined by the will of the people. And here, the war ministers are saying you can't agree to that. And he says, well, if the people don't want me, it won't matter what the language is. And that's a moment of self-awareness, I think, that's really important.
And all this craziness, a moment of realism. So, but it's still not over because the hotheads, of course, plot a coup. And the war minister has been kind of egging them on. His solution is to commit hara-kiri. He takes a sword, plunges it in his stomach, a dagger, plunges it in his neck, and he dies. But the young officers assassinate the head of the Imperial Guard and chop the head off of his aide and forge an order giving them control of the palace. So there are now soldiers running through the palace. What are they looking for? The emperor has made a recording of his surrender speech, which is supposed to be played the next day at noon over national radio, and the soldiers are trying to find this record to break it. Fortunately, it is in a bag hidden in a room that has been reserved for the ladies in waiting to the empress, so they never find it, and the leader of the coup goes down to the courtyard and shoots himself. The speech, finally, it's a marvelous speech. It says, the emperor tells his people, the war is going not necessarily to our advantage. They've been nuked twice in a week. Russia has declared war on them. But the speech finally happens, and Japan finally surrenders.
So most people don't know we were actually very close to dropping a third atomic bomb on Tokyo. And tell us why we know that.
This is in a cable. It's not generally known. Truman told the British number 2 guy in the embassy that reluctantly he had decided to drop a third bomb on Tokyo because the Japanese weren't surrendering. This is 4 hours before he found out that Japan was surrendering for real. We would have had a third bomb ready by about August 20th. This is August 15th. So Tokyo was spared.
And what was the fate of the 3 men, the 2 Americans and Togo?
So Togo was sentenced to 20 years in prison as a war criminal. This is crazy. We should have given him a medal. He saved, millions of people. But he had been in the cabinet during Pearl Harbor, so that even though he's opposed Pearl Harbor, that was enough to get him sentenced to prison. He died in prison. He had pernicious anemia. He died actually at peace with himself because he knew that he had done his best. Spaatz is a complicated story because he was a dutiful guy and he never complained about it. But his granddaughter told me actually he was miserable. And in his diary, the bombs are dropped on the 6th and the 9th of August. On August 11th, Spaatz writes in his diary that he's against dropping the atom bomb, just as he had always been opposed wiping out cities full of civilians, but he had been persuaded that the bomb would save lives, which was true. It did, but it still, of course, ate at him. And he, in his old age, he couldn't sleep, and his granddaughter would hear him moaning, and he confessed to her that he was just stricken with guilt over that bomb right before he died. Stimson, on the morning that Stimson showed the photographs of Hiroshima, on August 8th, when he shows the photographs of what Hiroshima looks like after the bomb, and what it looks like is the inside of an ashtray. It's just gray ash. He shows those, on the morning he shows those photos to Truman, Stimson has a heart attack. Now, he's 77 years old, he had a heart condition, coincidence, maybe, but, it was the same day he's showing the photos to Truman of what it really looked like, and Truman is shocked by it, and takes control of the bomb back from the military at that point, because he knows what we're doing now. Stimson has another bitch. Stimson changes his mind. He decides that we should share the secret of the bomb with the Russians. And he proposes to Truman that we have arms control. This is in September 1945. And Truman initially kind of goes along with them, but then ultimately says no. And so it's actually going to be decades before real arms control. But Stimson was bothered by this and wanted to trust. He didn't really trust. He didn't trust the Russians, but he wanted to trust the Russians. He used to say that if you want a man to trust you, you have to trust him. He said he learned that in Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones in Moscow, not quite the same thing. And even Stimson.
Yeah. As most of you know, the Russians had their own spies in the Manhattan Project, so they
knew the secret.
What Truman told Stalin about the bomb at Potsdam, and Stalin's answer was, "That's interesting. Hope you can use it." But then he called his side and said, "We better accelerate our program."
It took them 4 years.
Yeah.
They built it.
So how guilty do you think they should have felt, if at all?
I don't think they should have felt guilty because actually the bomb saved lives. In the perverse logic of war, they saved lives. They did kill 200,000 people. Yes, they did. But had we invaded, it would have been a bloodbath of truly epic proportions. You know, the Americans had about an invasion force of 900,000 men coming to they were supposed to invade in the Kyushu, the southern tip of Kyushu. The Japanese were waiting for them. And by August, the Japanese had 1 million men and 7,000 kamikazes and endless kamikaze sailors. And, you know, I mentioned my dad was a junior officer on an LST. Our estimates were that we would lose 200 LSTs in the first afternoon. So it was going to be a bloodbath. Now, I think by August, the Navy had started to say, you know, we agreed to this invasion, but now we don't agree. We think that we should blockade Japan and strangle them, starve them to death. Well, we had the capacity to do that by the late summer. We burned a lot of their cities, but now we were targeting their rail lines that carried the rice into the plain of Tokyo, the Kanto plain, where about 70% of the population lives. We could have cut off their rice supplies. They were already down to 1,500 calories a day. They were eating acorns already, but we were about to starve them to death. And that would have, you know, famines and disease that could have killed, I don't know, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions, who knows? Civil war. I mean, the consequences of not using those bombs and rather, you know, blockading and strangling Japan would have been more catastrophic than the bombs. I think and not just in Japan, but in Asia. It's now estimated that Asians were dying at the rate of 250,000 a month because the Japanese occupation was so horrific. One example of this, in Vietnam, there was a famine that killed 1 million people because the Japanese took the entire Vietnamese rice harvest and tries to use it to make aviation fuel, which they failed at. You know, it was just such a brutal occupation that by ending the war, suddenly, you know, they were able to grow rice again, and American ships arrived, typical America. You know, we brought all sorts of food to the continent and averted massive famine, not just in Japan, but in South China, Southeast Asia, all over the place. So I know it's an ugly calculus, but the bombs save lives.
You didn't mention Russia and any territorial ambitions they had on Japan.
That was another piece of the puzzle. The Russians, after the surrender, invaded Sakhalin and these northern islands right above their Hokkaido. There was a pitched battle up there. The only thing holding the Russians back was they didn't have ships. They didn't have enough ships. We had the ships. They didn't. They didn't have sea lift, so they couldn't get there. But they wanted to be co-rulers. We turned them down because they just recently declared war on Japan, and also we could because they didn't have the ships. But they wanted in, and had the war dragged on, you could imagine Japan splitting as Korea did into a north and south, and we could have had, we could have had that not just in Korea, but in Japan as well. That was not going to be a good situation for anybody.
So, looking back, what are the lessons for today?
Well, this is a book largely about moral ambiguity. These poor guys who are in these morally ambiguous situations where there is no good answer. But I hope there's no ambiguity about one thing. We should never use these weapons again. And I fear, Osi and I have talked a lot about this, I fear that the taboo, the weapons were horrible and people remember they were horrible, but that taboo can wear off. Later generations can forget. There's a lot of talk now about the Russians using a tactical weapon, that maybe if we have to fight with China, we would use a tactical weapon, the idea of limited nuclear war. I just don't believe in limited nuclear war. I think that once you start these things, they can get out of control. And we don't, those Hiroshima bombs that were pretty deadly, a standard nuclear warhead on an ICBM, on a submarine, or in a missile silo is 100 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. So the scale of this is much worse. We're not talking about, Central Park. We're talking about all 5 boroughs. The weapons are much worse. Also, when we dropped those bombs in 1945, we were the only ones who had them. So there was no risk of escalation. Now, our enemies and our friends all have them. So once you start the game, it's not over with you. They have them too. So the risk of escalation didn't exist back then. It does now. And that's something that we have to ponder. I hope the people who we have in charge going forward have as much wisdom as Stimson and Spaatz and Togo. Yeah. But there was an elaborate planning for November 1st in Kyushu, and then March 1st in the Big Island near Tokyo. And in fact, one of the measures of, I think they had 12 hospital ships lined up. They were manufacturing coffins like crazy. There's a coffin shortage. I mean, it was going to be a massive bloodbath. Yeah. The key to this book was, and this is true, the kind of writing I do, is to find their relatives. I mentioned Spaatz' granddaughter helped us with a diary and helped us, but the absolutely essential was that I found Togo's grandsons. And they are both, fortunately, westernized. One had been Japan's ambassador to the Netherlands, and the other had been worked for the Washington Post. And we talked a lot on, we were unable, we were supposed to go to Japan because of COVID, we couldn't go, but thank God invented Zoom. So we had many Zoom calls with Shige and Kazu, my new pals. But it's difficult because the Japanese, you've probably all seen the movie Lost in Translation. Even though both these fellows they're about my age, a little bit older, spoke English. There's still a translation issue. And we had on the phone with us a Princeton PhD named Brian Walsh, who had found through a Princeton professor as a friend of mine, and he lived in Japan, spoke Japanese. His wife was a translator. He taught in a Japanese university. He taught my subject matter at a Japanese university. And so I was really grateful to have him because he helped me understood what they were trying to say. The Japanese, for instance, this expression, don't speak ill of the dead. The Japanese actually believe that. We say it, but they mean it. And so they speak very circumlocutiously. And I really needed somebody who understood the language. One of the grandsons wrote a long paper on this with diary entries, but I needed a translator, and Brian Walsh did that.
We had fortunately gone to Japan in 2003 for an earlier book, Sea of Thunder. So on that trip for 2 weeks, we went to Etajima, their Maritime Defense Academy. We went to Hiroshima through their museum. We had a naval defense guide. We'd gone to Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. We'd gone to Kyushu. So as it happened, we covered a lot of the territory that it was useful this time.
They
had
were
side-by-side offices with connecting doors.
And the door was always open. Marshall is he's a great man and full of integrity, and Stimson and Marshall had a great bond, fortunately for the United States war effort. Marshall initially wanted to just use the bomb on a true military target, on a naval base. But he was persuaded that they might miss. Bombing was imperfect. And we only had 2 of these things initially.
And the jet stream was up there.
And the jet stream was blowing our planes away at 30,000 feet. So he was persuaded that we had to, drop on a city. He preferred Kokura, which had an arsenal in it. So he had qualms about, but to show you the moral ambivalence involved here, I mentioned that the Navy didn't want to invade, and the Air Force also didn't want to invade. But Marshall, an Army guy, felt that eventually they'd have to invade. And so he commissioned a study to use atom bombs as tactical weapons, to drop 9 atom bombs on Kyushu, on the 3 beaches, 2 on each beach and then 3 more in reserve. He also talked about, as he put it, drenching the Japanese in poison gas, which had never been used during the war. The point of this is that even Marshall, who is a humanist, and I'm sure had a conscience, he's running out of tools in his kit. And he's thinking about using poison gas and 9 atom bombs to end this damn war, and he's exhausted by it. There's a scene in the book that John McCloy, who's one of Stimson's aides, says to Marshall, "Do we really have to drop another second bomb?" And Marshall says, "Well, the emperor is tottering. We need to give him a push."
Yeah. He actually has his aide call Leslie Groves' office, and check on the safety of using these atom bombs. And he's told, well, if the invasion force is 6 miles off and waits 48 hours, then it's safe to go in after the 6 atom bombs are dropped.
Their understanding of radiation was crude. This in itself is an interesting thing, because the scientists knew that radiation was poison and would kill you. But it's as if you look at the record on this, it's as if they didn't want to know too much. They didn't really. There was a group in Chicago that was going, hey, whoa, radiation really bad, don't do it. But Oppenheimer kind of played it down. Groves really played it down, because they didn't want qualms over radiation to get in the way of using one of these weapons. So they didn't really share with Marshall or with Stimson that radiation is this horrible poison. So the meetings really weren't, and Harry Truman, I don't think, knew what radiation was. Why? Because I think they didn't really want to know. Yeah, I'm sure he would have done the same thing. I say that because there was an inevitability to it. The Japanese weren't going to surrender, and there was no amount of negotiating that we could do. We tried. There was, we were aware that the Japanese were talking to the Russians about maybe mediating, but our own intelligence services looked at that, and that was a kind of a half-hearted attempt to drag the Russians into the thing. The basic problem is, although I portrayed the Japanese as being crazy, actually in a way they weren't. What they wanted was not victory per se. They knew they had lost. Their fleet had been sunk. Their armies were being beaten. Their cities had been burned. What they wanted was good terms. By that, I mean they wanted no occupation. They wanted no war crimes trials, because these guys knew they're all going to hang if we catch them. And they wanted to keep the emperor. That's not crazy, because they figured that if they could make us bleed, they had a word for it, a Japanese word. Was it Seketsu? There's a word called meaning bleeding, the Japanese word for bleeding. That was their strategy. Make the Americans bleed so that we give them good terms. That's not crazy, because if we invade and we lose 100,000 men, we might have said, okay, keep the damn islands, no occupation, keep the emperor. We want out. We might have given them good terms. It wasn't nutty. What changed the equation was these atom bombs, because the military wasn't figuring on that. Japan had tried to build an atom bomb and failed. But once we started dropping atom bombs, this bleeding strategy is not going to work because we might never invade them. We might just drop atom bombs on them. So the military never totally capitulated, but they weakened just enough so the emperor was able to step in and say, stop. This was a sticking point. Truman had used the term unconditional surrender. And he used it a little bit. FDR had used it with Germans. We actually did not get an unconditional surrender. We let them keep their emperor, so that's not unconditional. So there was a little negotiation here, as I mentioned, at the end. So it was not unconditional surrender, but that term had a currency. It was politically popular. And the logic was, look, we've just fought a world war, never again. We're not going to let fascism grow back. We're going to end it now. And in Germany, we did that. We denazified. That was unconditional surrender. In Japan, it was almost unconditional surrender, but they did get to keep their emperor.
As a constitutional monarch with a constitution that said they'd never be an aggressive nation again, have an offensive military.
Yeah. I'm sure you've been reading, there is a revisionist school, which is actually, there's not revisionist, the dominant school. If you study in a university or college today, you probably will learn that it was not necessary to drop these bombs, that we did them to scare the Russians, that the real purpose was early Cold War intimidation of the Russians. There's, I believe, some truth to that, some evidence. Certainly Burns, the American Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, he wanted to scare the Russians. That was motivating him. And to some extent, maybe Truman. But I think the overall impetus, if you look at the whole thing, was we wanted to end the war. That was more important than scaring the Russians. Scaring the Russians was a piece of it, but a much bigger piece was just ending this damn war. And the bomb was, the initial order was, part of it was weather. They had these two bombs. There was supposed to be a 5 or 6 day gap between them, but weather was clothing in, and they delegated it to the military. So the military moved up the drop date
From the 11th to the 9th.
11th to the 9th. So
Russia had promised us that they would invade within 3 months of Germany's capitulation. That was the Yalta Accords. And it was only after we had the bomb that we realized maybe we didn't want their help, because we could see what they were doing in Europe, demanding Eastern European territory, Poland refusing to deliver medical supplies to our POWs as they liberated them. So they were not turning out to be the great allies that we wanted them to be.
There's a whole school of thought, academics are endlessly arguing over this, and there's a whole school of thought that there's a professor named Hasegawa who is kind of the lead thinker now in the academic community, and he posits that it was really the Russian invasion of Manchuria that turned the tide, because the Japanese were afraid of the Russians. They had hoped the Russians could be their allies maybe, or at least mediate a peace, and when Russia turned on them and declared war on them and invaded Manchuria on the night of the 9th, that was the decisive blow that got them to surrender. Again, I think that's a factor. I don't think it was a decisive factor. My reading is, and the scholarship goes on in this, these debates, history is what did Henry?
A never-ending argument.
Yes, you're right. Arthur Schlesinger, quoting some German, said, history is a never-ending argument. And of course it is. I got my story and I'm sticking to it, but a later generation of academics will come along with yet another version of this. That's the way history is written. I'm not sure what the publisher's claiming on this. I didn't have a ton of access to highly classified information. I had some, because Taddy Gresham, Tooey Spaatz' daughter, gave me some letters and diaries that were not out. And on the Japanese side, I did see. Almost everything on this has been declassified by now. This is, however, 70 years later. It takes, amazing how long it takes to declassify this stuff. In my CIA book, I did get heavily into this, and I had to negotiate with the CIA endlessly to get access to things. But by now, the record on the atomic bomb is, I would say, 99% out there. There may be something we don't know. Well, there is one piece we don't, not out. The Emperor's papers are still largely held back. There are a lot of diaries that tell us what we think the emperor was thinking, but there's probably more to come on the Japanese side from the emperor's own papers.
Memory yet?
No, I can't wait.
July, right?
Comes in July. There are going to be some good scenes. There's one that talk about guilt where Oppenheimer comes into the Oval Office in November and says, "I have blood on my hands," and Truman throws him out of his office and says, "I never want to see that crybaby again."
Thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming.